A proposal in Washington state that would have capped rents at 7% and made landlords give 6 months' notice before any rent increase failed. I'm Tony, and this is Real Estate Investing and Landlord News. All right, so I have an update to a video I did a little bit ago about a couple of new proposals in Washington state. Now, obviously, as I mentioned, there are a lot of states out there that they're always pushing these new progressive anti-landlord laws. And Washington state, they pushed this new 7% rent cap hike, or rent hike cap that would have limited the amount that landlords can increase the rent. So basically it's rent control, okay? And at the same time, they would have said any rent increase, a landlord had to give 6 months notice before they, could implement that rent increase. So landlords would have their hands tied. They would have to say way in advance that they were going to do a rent increase. Otherwise, they couldn't do it. So yeah, this really was a bad law for landlords overall. And surprisingly enough, it failed. Okay, it did not pass, and for now, it's off the table, and landlords don't have to worry about it. But hey, this could come up again, and I want to cover this because, simply put, this is the kind of thing that landlords in other states can look forward to, because these are the kind of anti-landlord laws that are being pushed all over the country right now. So before I get into the article, go ahead, hit the like and subscribe button, maybe leave a comment down below and let me know what you think. Are you surprised that this law did not pass in Washington state? I mean, I am. Honestly, I thought that they were so progressive, so, anti-landlord, anti-property rights up there that all new proposals would pass that, basically hurt landlords. But, for once, I'm surprised. And I'm going to get into the details of exactly what happened and why this didn't pass as I go through this article. So let's get into it. This article is coming from globestreet.com, and it says, bill to cap rent hikes fails in Washington state. Proposals would have set 7% cap required 6 months notice of hikes. All right, so yeah, let's read a bit about these details here. Two bills that aimed at addressing Washington state's housing crisis by capping rent hikes and requiring landlords to provide at least 6 months' notice of rent increases failed to pass the State House of Representatives this week, most likely ending the initiative this year. Landlords had lobbied fiercely against the bills, warning that the rent regulations would drive them out of the state. Proponents said the defeat of the rent caps would result in people in Washington sleeping in their cars, according to a report in the Seattle Times. Yeah, that's a bunch of garbage, okay? People aren't going to be sleeping in their cars because of a rent hike. Simply put, what we're going to end up with is, tenants might have a little bit more difficulty paying rent in some cases. In a lot of cases, they won't. The only thing this is doing, right, is it's creating a false government price control over the market, and that will actually negatively impact the market, make it so there's less affordable housing available, so the developers and real estate investors want to and do provide less housing and makes everything more expensive. And listen, Washington state in many places is already very expensive, so that's the last thing they really want. Now, a lot of people don't understand the unintended consequences of rent control, but that's exactly what would happen. Oh yeah, the funny thing that they mentioned here was that, let's see here, it says that people sleeping in their cars, they fiercely lobbied against it, okay? So, that's good, okay? It's good that the landlord groups came out. They probably have some sort of, legal defense fund set up for situations such as this. So let's continue. There are people who will lose their homes to rent increases this year, said Representative Alex Rammel of Bellingham, a sponsor of the cap on rent increases. Many of them will move into another home in another community, but some of them are going to lose their home and they're going to end up sleeping in their cars. It's garbage, okay? That's just garbage. They always say, they want to use the most shock. Oh, people are going to end up sleeping in their cars. Well, listen. Simply put, if you end up in your car because of a rent increase, you're probably going to end up in your car without the rent increase. The bills died without a vote when a key deadline for advancing them during this year's legislative session arrived Wednesday. The bills were pulled after opponents signaled they would unleash an avalanche of amendments, each requiring a vote, to run out the clock. The proposed bill would cap rent increases for tenants of older buildings at 3% or the rate of inflation, whichever is higher, up to 7% per year. The bill would have exempted housing built in the last 12 years and allow greater increases after renovations or for landlords who could provide significant hardship due to unexpected costs. So yeah, then you'd have to prove, like who are you trying to, you have to go up to some kind of board or some kind of bureaucracy or bureaucrats or unelected or elected politicians to try to prove that see, look, I have all these expenses and I need to raise my rents more than that. No. Okay, let us run our businesses like every other business is allowed to run. And if we need to increase cost in order to cover expenses, then just let us do it without jumping through all these hoops and, spending months on end petitioning, politicians and bureaucrats for permission to make improvements to our own dang buildings, And, as you can see, they capped the rent increase at 3% or the rate of inflation, right? But never more than 7%. So they can decide, and this is what they do up in New York, right? The rent control board up in New York decides, well, inflation is 0 this year, regardless of whatever inflation really is, right? But they do that on purpose so that the rent increase won't be above an amount that they see not positively, okay? So they screw landlords over to keep rents low, and they're not looking at the long-term effects of doing that. And we're starting to see those effects now as buildings fall into disrepair, as developers refuse to build new housing, as landlords get completely out of the rental business, or they just leave a ton of these rent-controlled units completely vacant because it's cheaper to keep them vacant than it is to rent them out. So yeah, you're going to see all these unintended consequences when you pass a rent control law. And fortunately, they did not pass it in this case. The bill also would have permitted who did not raise the rent this year to raise the rent next year. After a tenant moved out, there would be no limit on the rent the landlord could charge the next tenant under the proposed legislation. The other bill that failed would require landlords to give at least 6 months notice of rent hikes of more than 5% and would have allowed tenants to break a lease to avoid a rent increase of more than 5%. A similar measure was proposed last year and also failed. A third measure, which requires more documentation from landlords in order for them to keep a portion of a tenant's security deposit, passed in Washington's House this week. So yeah, more information about why you're keeping a security deposit and what your expenses were. Whatever. That's probably the least negative of the bills that was proposed. So at least that isn't going to too badly impact landlords. So it was actually funny when I was reading earlier, and it said up here that let's see here. There was a part here. Oh yeah, basically the way that they got this to fail was that they just they said the bills died without a vote when a key deadline for advancing it passed, right? So they just drug the process out so long that the deadline passed and the bill couldn't go any further. So these were the people who, the politicians, I should say, who were against rent control, didn't want this thing to even get to a vote, and drug the whole process out as long as possible. So it's kind of similar to like a filibuster or something like that, right? And you know what? So at least for the next year or whenever the next session is, they're not going to even look at this again. So that's a good thing for landlords. It's too bad that they actually had to use that sort of tactic, because that tells me that if it had come up for a vote, there might have been a chance that this sort of thing would have passed. So good for landlords up in Washington State. Hopefully, this will give you a little bit of relief temporarily, and that this doesn't come up again next year.
New York and San Francisco have very long rent control laws, old ones and severe ones. And yet when you look at the cities with the highest rents in the country, of any major cities, they are number 1, New York, and number 2, San Francisco. What happens in rent control around the world, really, because it's been tried so many times, is that people, if the rent control is severe, the people either reduce the amount of housing they build, or they stop building housing altogether. What happens, the political authorities are then confronted with the situation. Do you want to have situation where there's no new housing built and the old housing is wearing out, usually faster under rent control. They're restricting the amount of housing that can be built. And obviously, if you restrict the supply while the demand is growing, the prices will go up through the roof. They are preventing the evil landlords from raising the rent by rent control, and if they are able to keep the public paranoid that if they take off the rent control, it'll be just sky-high prices.